Lonesome Lands, episode 3, back at it. I did the first couple episodes this summer, which was me just kind of dipping my toe into it and see if I could put it together and actually get something out there. And what I realized when I did those is that it was going to take a lot more kind of time and planning. And so now I'm back at it. I was always kind of planning on coming back to it when I was able to get some episodes lined out and be able to really put out this consistently. And I think I'm at that place now. And I think when you hear what we talk about today, you'll kind of realize why it needs to be taught, why I want to start this thing back up right now. Also, I'm going to be at the Black Hill Stock Show on February 1st. I'm going to be speaking about some of the things that we're talking about today. And so today my guest is Margaret Byfield, and I've already recorded the episode, and every time I do this, there's always a couple things I wish I kind of would have focused in on more or said. And one of the things when you listen to this, I hope people think about is this climate smart commodities or climate smart project, which is what my last YouTube video was on. And it's what it is just a real push by the federal government to get farmers and ranchers, kind of used to the idea of calculating greenhouse gases and carbon emissions. And when you think about that, along with what she's going to talk about here, I think it really just kind of ties into this whole push to get everyone to kind of go along with this whole lie of the whole climate issue. And also the other thing I wish I would have brought up was eminent domain, and how right now there is proposed ideas of using eminent domain to put in a carbon pipeline. And a lot of, the reason eminent domain gets used or is allowed to be used is for what they call like the public good, like for putting in a railroad or even like a natural gas pipeline, something that's going to benefit the public. And if it becomes, if they can say that a carbon pipeline would benefit the public in that way, then what wouldn't they use it for? Would, any reduction in greenhouse gases or carbon emissions, would that benefit the public? And at that point, could eminent domain be used for putting a windmill on anyone's land that you decide it should go on, or putting solar panels on, taking private property and forcing the owners to put solar panels on their property? And those sound like some pretty crazy and far out ideas, but I think when you hear what is being proposed now and is actually in the works of happening, I think kind of you'll realize that pretty much anything is on the table. And so here is episode 3 with Margaret Byfield. Okay, so Lonesome Lands, this is a podcast. I'm going back to the podcast, and this is episode 3. And the reason I'm going back is because there is a time-sensitive issue, and I'm here with Margaret Byfield of American Stewards of Liberty. And Margaret, I will let you kind of introduce yourself and kind of explain what American Stewards does.
Well, sure. Well, thank you for having me on. And I really appreciate you looking at this issue. We are a property rights organization. And that means we work on all of these issues related to agriculture, lands. We really work to make sure that our people can grow our food, fiber, minerals, energy, be able to use our land. And our philosophy is that land is directly tied to our liberty. The people in America were meant to own the land, not the federal government, not environmental land trusts. They was to be owned by the people so that we could control our government and that we could be independent. I mean, that's the American core, is that we are self-sufficient and not dependent on governments or others. And it's our ability to own land and to produce from that land that gives us that ability. And so that's our core. That's what we fight for. So that means we get involved in some really major issues, and we have over our 30-year period, 30-plus year period since we've been in formation. And once the Biden administration was brought on board, that that obviously led us to start fighting the 30 by 30 issue. And now the new tandem issue along with that, the natural asset issue that we're fighting today.
Right. And so that's what I meant when I said time sensitive. There's a comment period ending January 18th on national asset companies. And I'll just give kind of the background on how I came onto this. And I just found out about this right before Christmas. I wrote an article and did a YouTube video about climate smart projects as USDA. They took $3 billion, and my point was their goal with that money was to get all of agriculture kind of on board with measuring greenhouse gases and carbon emissions. And so Trent Lewis had me on his show, and he said, this ties in, and you need to start looking into this national asset company. And so I really am not that familiar. So I'm kind of hoping, like Shad Sullivan wrote a piece yesterday, and I put that up on the website, and it explains it some, but I'm really hoping. I feel like maybe the main issue with this is just getting people to understand it, because it's kind of, it just doesn't make any sense at all, really, to me when I start hearing about it. But I wanted to ask you, like, so September 29th this year, the rule was proposed. Is that right?
Yeah, it was officially posed. It went in the Federal Register on October 4th.
Okay.
And so under the SEC rules, their rulemaking is a little different than what we're used to on the federal lands issues or some of these other environmental issues. The SEC rule allows for 21 days of comment, and then they are to make their decision in 45 days. So it's a very, very short time frame. What's interesting is when they came out with this rule, there was no press on it. It's the New York Stock Exchange that is making this application to have their manual changed so that they can put on the market these natural asset companies. So they're the ones who went to the SEC in partnership with the Intrinsic Exchange Group, which is a group that was funded and started by the Rockefeller Foundation. And so, when they first actually announced this was in September of 2021, and that's when we first started tracking it. And we were tracking it alongside of 30 by 30, which is the other big agenda we were fighting. And so they did come out with a press release when they formed this idea in September of 2021. But when they actually went to get the rule authorized, there was no press. Very quiet. Right. And so, we picked it up, and fortunately, we were able to start sounding the alarm and getting people up to speed on this. But they were supposed to make their decision November 18th. We got enough people involved and alerted. We had actually started educating our policymakers back in April on this of last year. So we had a number of key people ready to go when they did issue the rule. And so some key letters came out of the Senate by Senator Ricketts and Crapo and Risch that helped put the pressure on them. I think that's one of the reasons we got that first delay. And then, but when they decided not to make their decision on November 18th, they didn't reopen comments. They just extended their decision-making time. And so that deadline was January 2nd. And then in between that, Treasurer Oaks from Utah led 23 financial officers to oppose this. He's been fantastic. The other one who's been fantastic is Representative Harriet Hagman. She got 31 of her colleagues to write a very stern letter requesting information and asking that the comments be reopened. Between those two efforts, I think the SEC had to reopen the comments. So they reopened the comments, and now the new comment deadline is January 18th. And then there is a rebuttal period where you can rebut the comments that are filed, which is what we are planning to do because our comments are already in. And then the SEC will make a decision probably within about 60 days, unless a hearing is requested. So we could be looking at a decision in a very short time. Okay. And that's why it's so important for people to weigh in.
Right. And to go back to like wrap my head around this, you said there was a press release and that was in 21.
Yeah.
About this, like when you first heard about it. And who was that press release from?
Well, the New York Stock Exchange and IEG, they announced.
So this IEG,
the groups that are forming these. Right.
And this IEG, what you call that a group? Like, what is that? How would you explain that to?
So it's just a company that was formed in order
so it's
to
like a corporation.
create. Yes, in
Okay.
order to create these natural asset companies. It's the one that has brought forth this idea of monetizing and quantifying natural processes, things that nature does that they're not property. Nobody has a right to own them, like the air we breathe. They're the ones who have really advanced this idea, and that's what they're trying to monetize through
Right.
these natural asset companies. It's not just land. I mean, they can enroll land, but they're more interested in enrolling what they call ecological performance rights, and that's where it gets real crazy. They are literally creating new assets and trying to quantify them and monetize them, which is going to inflate our economy, create a bubble in the economy. I mean, there's so many, the market distortions are incredible with this concept, but it's this intrinsic exchange group that really came up with this idea in America, launched it in America, and is trying to create these natural asset companies, which then, of course, they'll profit off of as well.
Right. And to go more into that, like, because that's the hard thing to understand. It's just like they are trying to turn what into assets? Like you said, the air we breathe. Could you, like, how would they do that? Could you maybe give an example of how they are taking the air we breathe and turning that into something that it has a value? I guess that would be the way to think about an asset in this point is turning it into something that has a value, right?
Right. So they term it as natural processes. They call it natural capital. It's the natural processes and ecosystem services. It's the things that nature does that nature does on its own for all of us to live. So if you think about the process of photosynthesis is a good example. That's something they're trying to quantify and monetize. Clean air, we've already seen that really monetized in the form of carbon credits. They're talking about biodiversity credits. So when you read through their documents, you see that, they have a value on the land, they have a value on the water. The farmer puts a seed in the ground and a crop is created. And so he harvests the crop and that has a value. But it's that whole process that comes together that nature does that allows for that seed to grow into a plant. They're saying is not monetized. We haven't put a value on that. And that's what they are trying to put a value on in order to create this new asset for investors to invest in and ostensibly make a lot of money off of.
Right. But like, what is their reasoning? It's like if they say why we need to put a value on this, it's all climate, or like what do they say when they?
Yes, they say that it's all fueled by the climate crisis agenda. So the same entities that have been telling us that we're in a climate crisis, that we need to go net zero, that we need to decarbonize, get rid of our hydrocarbon fuels and energies, and that agriculture has been destroying the earth. That too many emissions, nitrogen fertilizers, all the bad things that they say that agriculture does. Those are all the reasons. They're saying that because of all those things, the way to solve it is to monetize these natural processes so that they can be controlled, and basically they can enforce their agenda of sustainability on the world in order to save ourselves. I mean, that's really kind of how ridiculous the argument gets, but that is what they're pushing. They're pushing the sustainability. And so that's their argument. And frankly, it's kind of hard to explain because I don't agree with it, and it's a bit crazy for me.
Yeah.
So, but that's the position they're coming at.
Right. It just goes against kind of logic and common sense, really, because so they've given their reason why they want to create this. And they came out with this in 21. And then they finally got the New York Stock Exchange. They came out. So the SEC didn't come out with this. The New York Stock Exchange asked for this to go on the exchange, right? And that's
Correct.
That's where the rule came from. Okay, and so
yeah, and it's important to understand the conflict of interest here, though. The New York Stock Exchange is actually a board member of this IAG corporation. So they have an invested interest in this.
Right.
So the announcement that came out in September was from the New York Stock Exchange and IEG combined.
Okay.
Announcing this new venture. And so, because this is such a novel type of company that they are trying to create, there's nothing like it in America. It doesn't fit under our economic system, and not even under our economic accounting system. That's why they have to use a UN accounting system for these, because it's so novel. And it's actually contrary to good market principles. The New York Stock Exchange needs separate manual language to authorize these. And the Security Exchange Commission has to approve that. So that's what this proposed rule is all about, is the SEC approving this new manual language so these natural asset companies can be created.
Okay. Yeah, it's just a lot to, and so how, and this IEG, am I getting that right, or is it EIG?
Mm-hmm. IEG. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And you said New York Stock Exchange is on the board. Is this like also like a BlackRock? I've talked about ESG a lot here in the last few videos I've done. Is there like a BlackRock, Vanguard, those corporations? Are they like also in and on the board, and are any of those big names like pushing it, or is there another big name that's pushing this?
Yeah, so it's primarily the Rockefeller Foundation. They're the ones who started this. But you can go to the IG website, Intrinsic Exchange Group, and they list all of their funding partners. And it is a lot of the same entities that you expect to be there. BlackRock isn't on that list, but we fully expect the BlackRock is going to be one of the investors in these NACs. But they also list supporting organizations. And that tells you a lot about the agenda, because the supporting organizations are things like the World Wildlife Fund and Conservation International, those entities that have been pushing things like conservation easements on landowners, because they will profit from this. Those conservation easements can be enrolled in a natural asset company with or without the landowner's permission. And whoever's holding those easements stands to make a fair amount of money by enrolling them in these NACs. And so the conservation, besides that these conservation, their groups, their agenda is to lock up the land, and they want control of the land. Right. They also have found a way to profit from it as well.
Okay. Yeah, and that's one of the questions I had. But before I get to that, as far as like, so it's just hard to imagine this stuff being on the exchange and like how it gets valued. But I suppose that's just further down the road. But they'll just classify things as like an asset, right? It's not going to be like, well, I'm going to invest in the air, or I'm going to invest in, certain plants, or, if you're wanting to buy something on the exchange, it would just be an NAC, and that NAC is like a group of natural processes. Is that?
Well, what they'll do, they'll set up individual natural asset companies, and each company will have its own area. So physical boundaries of land that will define the boundaries of that NAC. And then those ecosystem services that come from those areas have to be enrolled in that NAC. They can't be enrolled into the NAC next door. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's the footprint of the NAC. But then what they're enrolling, they can enroll private land. They can enroll enroll hard assets into this, but they are also the real increase in the value, which is what they are arbitrarily inflating, is saying that, let me give you an example. Let's say that there is a piece of land that is covered in timber. And in our traditional economy, you would harvest that timber, and therefore you generate lots of jobs, lots of local economy, income, revenue coming into the economy. And you have this product that the consumers want, construction materials that are purchased. So that would be our traditional economy. That would be the purpose of that land. Under a NAC, the land has to be protected and managed for its sustainability. So nothing can happen on that land that isn't replenishable. So now they're not cutting down trees. Now they are quantifying what is the carbon what am I looking for? The carbon credits that can come off of it. What is that? What is the value of that? And then they're putting that value on the balance sheet of the natural asset company and saying the natural asset company is worth X because of these carbon, of the clean air that's coming off of it.
And so
then they would do it with that. They do it with biodiversity credits. They do it with, put a value on photosynthesis. They do put a value on ecotourism. They put a value on things like the health benefit from people because there's more open space, so people should be healthier, and they come up with a figure there. And it's used to inflate and manufacture value for investors in this natural asset company. I mean, we've called it a scam from the beginning because it's really like a Ponzi scheme.
Right. Yeah, it keeps kind of like what you're saying. Like I read the Big Short and I've loved that movie. And so, and really what that whole thing, the whole mortgage crisis gets down to is they ran out of things to invest in or in, the more people buying mortgages, they ran out of people that were able to buy mortgages. And so they just made it easier and easier for people to buy mortgages because they wanted to they just wanted more things to invest in. They just needed more quantity. And it's kind of like, well, here, let's just dream up this whole new system of something to invest in. And it can just turn into this giant money scam. And the people who really kind of get it are the ones who are going to be getting rich. But then the messaging, I'm assuming, is going to be invest in this one, invest in these things and you're going to save the planet. Right.
And that's really, but the practical thing of these NACs, which I think is really dangerous for America, is that not only are they making up these assets and inflating our economy by doing so, but they are also, the SEC rule gives management authority over these assets in the NAC to the NAC company. So things can be enrolled, and it says this in the rule. Exhibit 3 of the rule makes very plain that our national parks can be enrolled in the NAC. And because the SEC rule gives management authority over those lands or those assets to the natural asset company, now whoever is investing in these NACs is essentially the manager of our national parks. Or if you have a conservation easement on your land, they're now the manager of your conservation easement. And so that's where it gets really dangerous. The other part of this is that there's no limitation on who can invest in these NACs other than what's already on the markets. So sovereign wealth funds from China, our adversaries, from Russia, they could be purchasing a majority interest in these NACs and be the manager of our national parks.
Because let's go back to that. How would, if you said that these private properties can be enrolled, I'm assuming that's up to the landowner?
Yeah, that's up to the landowner.
So if the landowner would want to, but as we've seen with, the solar and the wind and all the other stuff, they come, I suppose an NAC company would come around and be knocking on everyone's door, farmers and ranchers, and wanting to pay them to get them to enroll in these.
Yeah, and let me clarify, because of all of these climate smart programs that are going on private property, even through the CRP program, and which is, they're all conservation programs, a little different than the conservation easement, but they're really the same. It's very similar tools. They reduce production or eliminate production, so they fall under the sustainability requirement for a NAC. So the question that I think has been appropriately raised is, it's the federal government that's funding those programs. So who owns the ecosystem services that come off of that land? Is it the federal government or is it the private landowner? And we think that the federal government can enroll those rights, those ecosystem service rights, into these NACs with or without the landowner's permission. We don't have anything that says they couldn't. It's going to come down to who owns that, who decides that they own those ecosystem rights and therefore can enroll them in there. And I think that's going to be a big question. I know on the conservation easements, that's an absolute right. That you have sold to the land trust a development right. You can go to the Nature Conservancy's 990 and you will see the line item that shows how much value they own in conservation easements worldwide. That's a separate right that they can trade. They can transfer to to the federal government or another land trust. It's a separate right. And so they can enroll that on into a NAC with or without the landowner's permission. The landowner may decide the only way I'm going to get in on the caper because I'm, in such big trouble now that all my value is gone is to enroll the land alongside with them. But I think that our concern with 30 by 30 from the very beginning with these conservation programs was we knew these conservation programs were creating a federal nexus on the private property. We weren't entirely sure in understanding how they were going to be able to utilize those for the benefit of the federal government to get control of the private property. But now it makes sense if those can be enrolled in a NAC. So, and I'm telling you a lot of things that they're not entirely clear because the IEG and New York Stock Exchange has not been entirely clear with this agenda on what this is going to look like, and nor has the White House. So, but these things meet the definition.
Right, and that all seems by design, because to go back to 30 by 30, we didn't really talk about that much, but that's where I kind of first became familiar with you and met you. I've met you a couple different times when you've been talking about that issue, and that was before all of this. And so the way I was explained is President Biden, when he got in there, if you go back and remember, he was signing all these executive orders. It's like his first week in office. And one of them you found through the American Stewards because you were, I don't know, I guess I'll let you explain it.
Yeah, well, when President Biden was first elected, we started really watching the environmental literature because we figured they were going to set his agenda for property rights for our nation. And that's where we started picking up all of these articles on 30 by 30. And as we studied it, we realized this is going to be the agenda that he's going to advance. And so, yes, 6 days in, the executive order came out that at paragraph 216, just 2 little paragraphs that said that the goal is to conserve at least 30% of our land and ocean. And I think that if people hadn't been already aware of 30 by 30 and looking for it, that just escaped them. I mean, it didn't mean anything to them. And but since we were looking for it, we knew exactly what that meant. And then, of course, the DOI fact sheet came out that same day, which explained how they would be implementing that. And that's where you can trace, the 30 by 30 agenda all the way back to DOI, that this is exactly what they were intending to do, was permanently protect 30% of our lands and oceans by 2030 through this agenda. And so, we knew it was coming, so we were pretty prepared. We got on the phone with one of the first county that passed the first resolution to oppose this, Garfield County in Colorado. And they had a resolution prepared and passed within 3 weeks. We had our first 30 by 30 guide, which is like a 16-page guide that was, we put out there so that people could get up to speed on 30 by 30 quickly, free, downloadable, and just started spreading it around. And, our people, the grassroots, they do what they do, which is phenomenal. All we have to do is get them educated and they know what to do. And so they started passing these resolutions all over the country. And I think the last count, we were up to about 160, 170 of these. And I still get them, coming into us of counties still passing these resolutions, which is really important. But that really, it was very helpful to get the fight started and on 30 by 30 to where 3 months in, the Biden administration changed the name of this program. They no longer called it 30 by 30. They called it now America the Beautiful. So it sounds more palatable to the people. But that program, though, when you connect all the dots with the NAC agenda. Really, the purpose of 30 by 30, and we said this from the beginning, that 30 by 30 was not about conservation, it was about control. The purpose of 30 by 30 is to create the protected lands so that the NACs can now put these protected lands and these new contrived assets into an investment vehicle, and they can profit off of it. So we fully expect to see things like BlackRock, the China and Russia sovereign wealth funds investing in these NACs because it's the direct way to control America, is if they can control their lands.
Right.
So the two agendas definitely intersect, and it has been, the big agenda for a while.
Yeah. And so just to lay it out, like 30 by 30 was really the plan to get as much land as possible into these conservation easements. And
Yes.
now the plan is to take that land that's been placed there and turn it into something that can be traded on the stock exchange. And so we talked about private property, and then you mentioned the national parks also. But what about like all of the federal ground? Like, I have mainly talk about cattle industry. I talk about agriculture, but a lot of it's cattle, and there's a lot of cattle that's ran on BLM ground. And so I guess my question would be, what is the plan with that? And really, so if they're creating this value off of a national park, who, like, for the private property owner, they're going to get paid by the NAC. What does the NAC do with a national park? Where would that money go? Like they would pay a private property owner? How do they pay for a national park?
No, it would. So that would be the federal government enrolling our national parks in a NAC.
Okay.
Or the federal government can create its own NAC. But it's a way for the federal government to generate more income.
Okay. Yeah. So they would be the one trading it. Yeah. So you'd been investing in that. And that's the same with BLM ground? Like this federally owned ground? The
BLM ground is really interesting because I'm sure most of your listeners are aware that the BLM advanced a proposed rule that will elevate conservation as a priority over the multiple uses. So the BLM land is the whole purpose of the BLM land, and the whole purpose for the Bureau of Land Management Agency is to effectively manage and make sure that multiple uses can be carried out on our federal lands at the same time. So you can have a piece of land that is being grazed through a grazing allotment held by the rancher that's also being mined, that also has oil and gas on it, that people can also recreate on, that you can harvest timber on. And the purpose of the Bureau of Land Management was to manage all of those uses to make sure that they all continued forward. So the BLM, what they did under last year was they advanced this new proposed rule, which would elevate the conservation of the lands over the multiple uses. So now they are talking about creating conservation leases instead of a grazing lease. And when the conservation lease goes into play on some of these lands, wherever they would do them, that has to be managed sustainably. And there can't be anything going on those lands that would harm that conservation purpose. Does this language sound familiar?
Yes.
Because it's the same language to create these NACs. So what we have is the Bureau of Land Management has been working in tandem with really this concept of NACs in order to set these federal lands up so that somebody can acquire these conservation leases, which would be enrolled in the NACs. And I read one position paper recently that I think really had a really good thought on this, that it's really the NACs that are going to be the ones that they raise the money for the NAC in order to purchase the conservation lease, in order to make sure it stays out of production.
Right.
So there's a couple different ways that this could happen.
Yeah. And that's the main thing to think of is when you say, make sure it stays out of production, like odds of getting a lease for cattle on any BLM land that's involved in this would be, it just wouldn't happen. Correct. Right? Yeah.
Yeah. And that is the ultimate goal of the NAC. And that's why it defies investment logic, because it's not producing anything. So how are people going to make money off of this? Because the purpose of the NAC is to make sure that there is no production on the land. I mean, the rule specifically says there can be no mining and oil and gas, and that everything that occurs on those lands has to be done in a sustainable way. And then the definition of sustainable it ties back into a UN document, a very interesting new experimentational set of financial principles that is what the NAC is going to be using to quantify and monetize these natural processes. So their definition of what's sustainable is also very loosely alluded to. It's going to change over time. What they may say today, this is what sustainability looks like today. And yeah, sure, you can go ahead and you can do regenerative farming here, which is what they say right now. 10 years from now, that may change. They may decide that regenerative farming is bad. And so, but everything that the NAC is really designed to do is to eliminate production of the land. And that takes us to the bigger question, which is if it's going to be the sovereign wealth funds like China that's investing in this, it's to their advantage to make sure we are not able to produce critical minerals, oil and gas, or any other food from our land. It's advantageous to them that we are not able to do that. So this NAC gives them the ability to control the production of land, what is produced off of America's land, to our foreign adversaries. That's what this very simple little rule that SEC has advanced and that they were poised to decide favorably for on November 18th of last year. That's what that rule opens up.
Right. Yeah, it's very serious. How many people do you think are really aware of this? Like, has this been talked about on, when you think of the SEC proposing this crazy new market, really? Like, you would think that they would have entire segments on CNBC or Fox Business or because we're talking about stock exchange and all these business networks and there's so many media people that cover business. Has it been covered at all?
A little bit on air, but not as much as it needs to be. Treasure Oaks published an article or an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. That was very good. That alerted the business community. I've been on Steve Bannon's War Room show talking about this. That's a whole nother audience that's been out there. There's a whole national security audience that has been laser focused on this. There's a great coalition, and we've been working with them as well. We have, the 23 state financial officers that signed the letter with Treasurer Oaks to oppose this and bring awareness to it. That actually generated a lot of press and a lot of bigger media papers on it. And then just yesterday, 25 attorney generals signed a set of comments that went into the record, the SEC record, where they point out in very clear terms how the SEC rule violates the law. And it's a phenomenal letter. So I think, and then there are just groups all over that have, as they've learned about it, they've jumped on board and have fought this. So I would say that on October 4th, when they approved this, I could probably count on both hands how many people really understood what this was. And fortunately, we just work with some really good people that they got to work and got busy, and they've been just very good at helping to spread the word. We've made 2 trips back to DC since the rule came out, educating key members. Every meeting we would go into, they would say, wow, this is the first time we've ever heard about this. Now we're at the point, we're doing a lot of calls on, just via Zoom with a lot of the staff and even members. And they are aware of it now. There is an awareness. So it's happening, and we need more, but it is getting out there.
So what are these comments? I mean, in the beef industry, there was a comment period on importing beef from Paraguay, and I read through the comments. I'm not sure if anyone actually recorded them or wrote anything down, but there was almost all negative. There was a few positive comments that I ever read, and they were all from Paraguayan ranchers. wanting to import their beef. But then the USDA came out and they said, okay, we're going to start importing beef from Paraguay. How much, like, we have these comment periods, and like you just said, 25. So half of the state's attorney generals have come out against this plan, which to me seems like, well, there's no chance that works when you have half of the states very much against it. Can you talk about that a little bit? Like, what are the odds of this actually happening at this point? Or, what that comment period even, like, can they ignore it completely, or how is that going to work?
Well, I don't think they can ignore it, because the strategic thing that the attorney generals did today is they got their position in the record. So now they have standing. So if SEC approves the rule, they're in position to sue. So that's important. That's why them weighing in, 25 states weighing in, is really important. Now, does that mean that's going to slow the White House down? If they really want something, we can see our border issue and see how many times the White House has sued Texas to keep us from
right. That's
guarding our border. So, but what's really important is that that move today means that the fight is on. Right. The attorney generals are serious about this, and they are going to defend this. I know the state treasurers are as well. And of course, every entity that puts comments into that record is in a position to join in an action and sue on that. We put our comments in, and we, with the full intent that if we had to sue on this, we would do so. And so that's where, there's a lot of groups that have positioned so that we are able to do that if the SEC decides to move forward with this. But, I think we have to keep the pressure on. I think it's actually really important to question why the New York Stock Exchange is involved in this kind of an effort, which is so contrary to good investment practices and a healthy economy. I mean, that's their other clients. That's what they need, is a healthy economy, and they're directly competing with them by closing down production through these NACs. And so I think the New York Stock Exchange has some explaining to do. They could withdraw this rule. This is their application. They can withdraw it. So, for your listeners, I would say go to the SEC portal. You can go to our website at americanstewards.us, and we have a link there, and you can go to the portal and you can put a comment in, and it can be one paragraph. It could say, we incorporate the position of American Stewards of Liberty's comments, or of RCAF's comments, or of, any other comments in there, of the Attorney General's comments, of, find a position that you agree with and just incorporate that and get that in the record. I think that's going to be really important, because it's the public pressure that is going to really, the bad PR that is going to get these guys to back down. We have to understand, we are fighting Wall Street. So we don't have a checkbook like Wall Street does. And they can pretty much come in and buy whatever they want. Our power is in the public exposure of what they're trying to do. And that's why your platform here and taking the time to really dive into this and understand it, I think, is so important. I really believe that, our people, if they understand this, they're going to fight this. And we're in a very good position to stop this if we stand up and we fight it.
Right. And I'll put all those links in the description here for the video. To go back to agriculture real quick, you talked about RCAF. Are there any other groups? Because what I found when I talked about this climate smart these climate smart projects, which is, and you talk about how we're fighting Wall Street, but I feel like we're also fighting, Wall Street is teamed up with the federal government on this whole climate issue. And so we're actually fighting the federal government, which is even tougher. But I've found, because of all the money that's getting pushed in, like, it seems like Farm Bureau has came out and promoted these climate smart projects with all this money coming out. Are there any, and I know, like, you talked about net zero earlier, and the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, I think 2 years ago in I think it was 2021 came out, and their number one goal was like a net zero. I think their year was 2040, but they have a sustainability goal of net zero. So they're kind of all in on this sustainability issue. Are there any other like ag groups that are promoting this or are fighting back against it? I guess nationally mainly.
Yeah, we haven't seen any of the major agriculture groups put a comment in, so we don't know what their position is. We don't know if they're going to be for or against yet. We do know, and I haven't had any conversations with them, so I simply just don't know. But we have seen the Texas Farm Bureau put a set of comments in that opposes the NACs, and I thought that was very good. Yeah. So that was very good. So I can't tell you what the national groups are going to do. I mean, other than RCAF has been pretty vocal about their opposition. The other groups, I think because of, the issue that you pointed out, they have been all in on the sustainability agenda. And I know a lot of people have been warning about getting on that bandwagon, that it would come back and hurt us eventually. And that's what we're really seeing. That's where we are right now. So I'm not quite sure how they get out of that problem. But, we're just at a point where it's time to get off the fence. Instead of having a seat at the table, we really need to stand up and fight these things and come together on them. This is not about, the paycheck you're going to get tomorrow. This is about the kind of country we're going to turn over to the next generation and whether or not our children are going to have any sense of liberty like we have today. Because right now we're selling it out. We're selling it out through these conservation programs. We're selling it out through conservation easements, which dilute that property right. And that's the bigger issue for me is, I want our people to get back to thinking about what our founders did, what they gave up, so that you and I sitting here have the liberty that we have today. I mean, they weren't looking about whether or not, how much am I going to get out of this crop, and can I get this federal payment in order to help me get through this season? They were putting their life on their line because liberty was that important to them. And we need to get back and be looking long-term and not short-term. We need to be looking at what is at stake here. Is it sustainability, which is a bunch of hogwash? I mean, this whole notion that's been pushed by the climate crisis is hogwash. I mean, it's all built on sand. All of the climate crisis arguments are built on these models, these projections into the future, not hard science, not sound facts. And we're supposed to change our entire lifestyle based on that. And that's what the sustainability represents. And so, buying into that sustainability agenda, it's a whole agenda that is just based on sand. It has no solid foundation to it. We need to get back to protecting our property and therefore protecting our individual liberties.
Right. Yeah. And I wanted to thank you for everything you do. I've thought about where would we be without your work on 30 by 30 or groups like yours that will scan through all of these executive orders, because really the end goal is to take away these property rights. But to also talk say to anybody who's considering signing an easement for anything on their property to really look into and research it. And do you have sources on your website or numbers for people to call or anything like that? On our website,
under the NAC page that we put up, the Natural Asset Companies page, there's a really good little guide called Conservation Easement or Servitude. And that's just a very simple read for landowners. We did it for landowners. It's the 13 things that the land trusts don't tell you about conservation easements. And so it's a really good piece to understand how the property is diluted when you put a conservation easement on it, and your control of that property is diluted. So I would highly recommend people read that. Sign up for our publication. We do an online Liberty Matters news service every 2 weeks. And that's really where we advance these ideas or these issues as they're coming forward. I think we published our first article on NACs back in, I think it was August of 2023. and where we did a deep dive on NACS so that our people would be aware of this, and which was thankfully we did, because then we did a few news alerts on it, through our online publication, and that meant when the SEC rule came out, our people were ready. They had an idea of what this was, and so they got to work quickly. Yeah. And that's that. You were giving us credit, and thank you for that. But at the end of the day, it's our people that respond. We can get the information out there, but it's the people, the boots on the ground, that respond and help light the fire on these issues. That's what brings the awareness. So, I got to give you and everybody else out there that jumps on these issues and gets to work. That's what saves the country.
Right. And I feel like I'm a little behind, but that's pretty amazing. Like you had no idea that rule was coming, and you were really just a month ahead of.
Yeah, no, we did not know it was coming, but, we had seen just enough things. There's a whole other White House strategy where the White House has done, they implemented a strategy in January of 2023, which creates natural capital accounts, which is another way of taking these ecosystem services and putting them on the federal balance sheet. So we've been tracking that as well. And so just watching the two entities, you can kind of watch when you're seeing more stuff in the press, and, you think, okay, they're getting ready to make a move. And so that's why we started. We thought we've got to get our people up to speed. We know this is coming. We've got to give our people an advance notice so that they can be ready.
Okay, that kind of leads me into the last question I have for you, because you talked about the media and how this stuff leaks into the media. On the TV show Yellowstone, which is apparently the highest rated TV show, I just was curious if you're familiar, and I'm not that familiar with it, and so I don't really know exactly how they used it, but they do talk about conservation easements on there, and I believe the Dutton Ranch is the ranch that the main ranch that they talk about in that TV show, and they signed part of their property into these conservation easements. And I think the storyline, I'm just all going off of kind of a vague memory of one episode I saw, but the storyline was that they put this land in a conservation easement to save it. I think it was an airport or something that was coming in. Okay, so you're familiar. I just wondered, and this could probably be a whole nother, we could probably talk a whole nother 40 minutes on this, but I was curious if you had anything about that, or just what your thoughts were on that, because you probably are more familiar with it than I am.
Well, I did have somebody send that to me and tell me that they had done that on the program. I don't watch the program, so I'm not as familiar with all the ins and outs of it. But that's a PR program, and it's romanticizing the Western lifestyle. And then it's infusing into it the vision, I think, of those behind that, the Yellowstone programming, on where they want to see things, head. So it doesn't surprise me at all that they put a conservation easement in there, and they made it sound really, really good and the way to save something, because that's the way it's sold to landowners. But so they've romanticized it. And that's very dangerous, because there are a lot of bad parts to a conservation easement, and those are signed in perpetuity. And so a lot of the landowners find out about that when it's too late. It's over. So I'm not surprised that they've romanticized it, but what I would ask your audience is just, if you're considering one, you need more information. You really need to dig into this. And that's why we put that little guide together, is so that it'll get you, it's 13 points to consider, but then that'll lead you to other questions. And what I found is, and I had this one today, somebody was getting ready to sign a conservation easement, and they had heard us on the Steve Bannon show. And so then he started looking into conservation easements a little bit deeper, and he emailed today and said, okay, I'm not doing it. Now I know what to ask. Of course, this isn't something we want to do to our land. And so right. I just think it's really getting people educated, and so that they can make a better decision.
Yes. Well, thank you. Thank you for doing that. I'm definitely better educated just in this last 40 minutes on this deal, but AmericanStewards.us, is that right?
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. And so go there if you have any questions about this. And thank you very much for coming on. And January 18th, like I said, I'll put the links to how to comment and your comments, or I'll put a link to your website where you show your comments. And that's about it. So unless you had anything else.
No, just I really thank you. Thank you for doing this discussion and getting this word out. It's really important. So thanks for your help.
Yeah. Thanks for coming on.